Chapter 1. A New Start. When old Mr. Nick Nickleby died at home in Devon, in the southwest of England, he left many debts behind him. Once these were paid, his wife, his son Nickolas, and his daughter Kate found themselves with little money and no house to live in. There was only one person that they could turn to for help: Ralph Nickleby, the children's uncle. Mrs. Nickleby didn't really know him, but because he was in the London finance business, he was rich and knew many people. Before her husband died, he said that Ralph would help them. So she wrote a letter to say that they were coming, and the very next day they all travelled to London. Soon after they arrived, Ralph Nickleby came to the little house where they were staying. He wore fine clothes, but had cold eyes and a hard voice. He didn't look very sad about his brother's death.
"How did he die?"
he asked Mrs. Nickleby.
"The doctors don't really know what the problem was. We think that perhaps he died of a broken heart,"
replied Mrs. Nickleby.
"I've heard of people dying of a broken neck, but a broken heart? Never. A man can't pay his debts, and so he dies of a broken heart. Ha!"
laughed Ralph Nickleby coldly.
"Some people have no heart to break,"
said Nickolas to himself quietly.
"How old is this boy?"
asked Ralph Nickleby, looking angrily at Nickolas.
"Nearly 19.
replied Mrs. Nickleby.
"And how will you pay for your food now, boy?"
Ralph Nickleby asked Nickolas.
"I shall not cost you or my mother anything at all,"
replied Nickolas. For a while, Nickolas and his uncle looked at each other without speaking. The older man saw in front of him a young man who was kind and honest, and from that moment he hated him. Then Ralph Nickleby talked with Mrs. Nickleby about finding work for poor but beautiful Kate. Turning back to Nickolas, he showed him an advertisement in the newspaper that he had with him.
"Mr. Wackford Squeers, staying at the Snow Street Inn in North London, needs a teacher for his school in Yorkshire. Call today."
Yorkshire was far away, in the northeast of England. But Nickolas was excited.
"Perhaps our luck is changing,"
he thought.
"We must go and see Mr. Squeers immediately, before he gives the job to another young man,"
said Ralph Nickleby. When Nickolas and his uncle arrived at the inn, Squeers was busy with some new students. He was a short man, about 50 years old. He had only one greeny-grey eye in his face, where people usually prefer two, and he looked very strange in his black suit, which was too long for him in the arms and too short for him in the legs.
"Mr. Squeers, this is my nephew, Mr. Nickolas Nickleby. We're here because of your newspaper advertisement,"
said Ralph Nickleby.
"He's too young to be a teacher,"
Squeers said at once, looking at Nickolas. But after talking quietly with Ralph Nickleby for a while, he turned back to Nickolas with a smile, saying,
"The job is yours. Our coach leaves at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. Be here early to help with the new students.
Certainly,
replied Nickolas. And to his uncle he said,
I shall never forget how kind you've been.
The next day, Nickolas said goodbye sadly to his sister and his mother at the inn.
How will they survive without me?
He thought with a heavy heart. Just before Nickolas got onto the coach, someone pushed a letter into his hand. It was Newman Noggs, Ralph Nickleby's clerk. Nickolas quickly put it into his pocket. The journey to Yorkshire was long and hard, and they stopped at different inns on the way. Squeers ate a lot at every meal, but gave very little food to the students who were with him.
He worries more about the cost of the meals than he does about those poor, hungry boys,
thought Nickolas. In the evening of the second day, they arrived in Yorkshire. There was snow everywhere, and in front of them was a long, low building with dark windows. It looked cold and unpleasant. This was the school, Dotheboys Hall. Inside, Mrs. Squeers was waiting for them. She looked at Nickolas coldly, then turned to her husband.
How is my Squeery?
She said.
Very well, my love,
replied Squeers.
How are the cows and the other animals?
Very well.
And the boys?
Asked Squeers.
Oh, they're well too,
replied Mrs. Squeers quickly in a hard voice. After that, they talked about parents who paid their debts to the school and parents who couldn't pay. Then Mrs. Squeers put a cold supper on the table for her husband and for Nickolas. Squeers ate and drank a lot. Nickolas had only a little. Then they all went to bed. Before he went to sleep on his bed on the floor upstairs, Nickolas took Noggs's letter from his pocket and read it.
My dear young man, I know the world better than you. The place that you're going to isn't like any place that you know. If you ever need somewhere to stay in London, ask for me at the Crown Inn in Golden Square. They know me there. Don't think that I'm strange writing to you like this. I was once a gentleman, but I've come down in the world. Your friend, Newman Noggs.
If Nickolas's first night at Dotheboys Hall was bad, the next day was worse. He soon saw that Mr. and Mrs. Squeers loved making the boys there suffer. Squeers beat them hard and often. He read their letters from home himself, telling them that their parents didn't love them and didn't want them back. The boys had no real lessons, but did jobs for Squeers in the school and its garden all day. They were especially cruel to one boy, Smike. He was taller and older than the other boys at the school, perhaps 18 or 19. His clothes were old and too small for him, and he looked ill. At the end of his first day, Nickolas found Smike working in the kitchen. He saw in the boy's eyes that he was afraid.
Don't be afraid of me,
said Nickolas kindly.
Oh, my poor heart will break living here.
Smike cried.
No, it won't. There's always hope.
Not for me.
Replied Smike.
I've got no family or friends. It doesn't matter if I live or die. There's only suffering for me in this life.
Chapter 2. Life at Dotheboys Hall. After the night that they first met and talked in the kitchen, Smike followed Nickolas everywhere. But when Squeers saw this, he beat Smike more than before.
They're harder with me than ever.
Smike cried one evening to Nickolas in the empty schoolroom.
I know.
Nickolas replied, putting a hand on Smike's shoulder kindly.
You'll be happier when I've gone.
Are you leaving?
Asked Smike, suddenly worried.
No,
said Nickolas.
I was just thinking aloud.
But will you go one day?
Yes, one day I must go out into the world.
And can we meet? Out in the world?
Asked Smike.
Of course,
said Nickolas.
And I'll help you there, and not make your life worse, as I've done here.
Just then, Squeers arrived, and Smike disappeared. Smike was not Nickolas's only worry at Dotheboys Hall. There was also Squeers's daughter, Fanny. One day, not long after Nickolas arrived, Fanny went into the schoolroom to get a pen. Nickolas gave her a friendly smile.
What a wonderful smile he has,
she thought, and at once she decided that she was in love. Soon after that, Fanny asked Nickolas to tea when Mrs. Squeers was out. Fanny's best friend Tilda and Tilda's fiancé, John Brodie, also came. There was bread and butter to eat, and Nickolas ate it very fast. When he saw this, John Brodie started laughing.
You won't get fat if you stay in this school, he said.
John, don't speak to Mr. Nickleby like that,
cried Fanny.
Oh, Fanny, shall we leave you and Mr. Nickleby alone?
Asked Tilda, laughing.
Oh, no, please don't go,
said Nickolas worriedly. He suddenly saw the way that things were going. Then, because he didn't want to raise Fanny's hopes of love, and because Brodie was a man of few words, he began to talk with Tilda. This made both Fanny and Brodie very angry. In the end, Tilda and her fiancé went home. Fanny started crying, and Nickolas went off quickly up to bed.
I must stop trying to be friendly to everyone,
he thought.
It just gets me into trouble.
One morning, not long after that, Squeers woke everyone by shouting from the kitchen downstairs.
Are you going to sleep all day, you lazy dogs?
We're coming down now,
shouted Nickolas from the big, long bedroom upstairs, where he and the boys all slept.
Smike!
Called Mrs. Squeers.
Come down here at once!
There was no reply. Nickolas couldn't see Smike at all.
He's not up here,
he cried.
That's what you say,
shouted Squeers.
I'm coming up to find him.
I think that he's run away,
said Nickolas when Squeers came upstairs. Squeers was very angry.
How do you know that?
He asked. Now Mrs. Squeers came upstairs too.
Smike has run away, my dear,
explained Squeers.
That's no surprise to me,
said Mrs. Squeers, looking at Nickolas with an ugly smile.
You helped him.
I did not,
replied Nickolas hotly.
I'll beat the life out of him when we catch him. Which way do you think he went?
Squeers asked his wife.
Who knows? You take one coach and go towards York. I'll borrow another coach and go the other way,
replied Mrs. Squeers. For the rest of the day, Nickolas waited at the school with the other boys and worried. In the evening, Squeers came back, but Smike wasn't with him.
Someone will pay for this,
said Squeers angrily.
I'm telling you, Nickolas.
It's nothing to do with me, sir,
said Nickolas, and he went to bed. It was clear that Squeers wanted Smike back at the school, just because the boy did lots of work there for nothing. Early next morning, Nickolas heard a coach arriving at the front gate, and Mrs. Squeers calling for her husband. Afraid of the worst, Nickolas looked through the window and saw Smike in the coach. His tired face was covered with mud and rain, and he looked nearly dead. Mr. Squeers came from the house and took him inside. He put him in the cellar and locked the door. He was looking forward to beating him later. After lunch, Squeers told all the school to come to the classroom. When everyone was there, he brought Smike into the room, pulling him by his coat.
Well, Smike, explain yourself.
Please, sir, forgive me.
Oh, yes, I'll forgive you when I've finished beating the life out of you.
Ha! That's a good one,
shouted Mrs. Squeers. Squeers had a new whip to beat Smike with. He raised it, then brought it down hard on Smike's body. The poor boy screamed. Then, suddenly, they heard a shout.
Stop! Who said that?
Asked Squeers, looking round the room in great surprise.
I did! This mustn't go on!
Cried Nickolas, who was now very red in the face.
Mustn't?
Cried Squeers. He took his hand from Smike's neck, raised his whip again, and used it to hit Nickolas in the face with all his strength. Nickolas at once pulled the whip from his hand and began to beat him. Squeers screamed for help, but Nickolas went on beating him angrily. Mrs. Squeers tried to pull her husband away, and Fanny hit Nickolas from behind with her hands, but they couldn't stop the attack. At last, Nickolas left Squeers, not moving but alive, to his wife and daughter. He couldn't see Smike anywhere, so he hurriedly put some clothes in a bag and left the house. He decided to go at once to London. But how? It was far away, and he had no money. Chapter 3. The Road to London. After walking away from Dotheboys Hall for some time, Nickolas saw John Brodie on the road in front of him, carrying a big stick.
Oh no. Will he hit me with his stick?
Thought Nickolas.
After what happened at tea the other day.
Good evening, young gentleman,
said John Brodie when they met.
Look, I'm sorry about what happened when you came to tea,
said Nickolas.
I didn't mean anything by it. Will you forget it and shake hands?
Of course,
said Brodie, and he gave Nickolas his hand.
But what's happened to your face?
Nickolas told him everything. When John Brodie heard about Nickolas beating Squeers, he suddenly gave a great shout of joy.
That's the best news that I've heard in 20 years,
he laughed.
But what will you do now?
I'm going to walk to London.
Good luck. It's a long way to walk. Here, take some money and my stick. You'll need it,
said Brodie kindly, and he gave Nickolas £1 and his stick, and then went on his way. Stick in hand, Nickolas walked off towards London. He slept that night in the cheapest inn that he could find. He walked all the next day, but at night he could find only a barn to sleep in. After a deep sleep, he woke up early the next morning and saw Smike standing in front of him.
Smike! How did you come here?
When you left the school, I followed you all yesterday. I slept in this barn last night too. I didn't want you to see me, but this morning you woke up too quickly for me to hide. Please take me to London with you. I'll do anything. I'll be your servant. I just want to be with you.
Of course you can come with me, but not as my servant. We'll go out into the world together, and what we find there will be for both of us.
So they started their long walk together. On the way, Nickolas thought,
we'll go and look for Newman Noggs at the Crown Inn. He'll tell me where I can find Kate and my mother.
Some days later, late at night, Newman Noggs was at home when he heard visitors at his door. Opening it, he saw Nickolas and Smike standing there, both exhausted. He asked them in and gave them something to eat and drink. Soon after that, they both fell asleep. The next morning, Nickolas told Noggs their story.
I knew most of that already,
said Noggs when he finished.
Fanny Squeers wrote a long letter about it all to your uncle, you see.
And does it tell the same story?
Not really. The letter says that you used bad language, that you nearly killed Squeers, that you attacked her mother and herself, and that you stole one of Mrs. Squeers's rings.
But that's not true,
shouted Nickolas.
No one who knows me could believe it. I'll go and see my uncle and explain what really happened.
Wait a minute,
replied Newman.
Ralph Nickleby hates you, so he'll say that he believes what's in the letter. You must go and see your mother and sister and explain things to them before your uncle talks to them. I'll show you the way to their house.
But when they arrived at his mother's house, Ralph Nickleby was already there. Kate ran to Nickolas and embraced him.
"Oh, Nickolas, you're back!"
She cried, full of joy at seeing her brother again.
Your uncle has told us terrible things about you and Mr. Squeers,
said Mrs. Nickleby sadly.
Are they true?
No, Mother. It didn't happen the way that my uncle told you,
replied Nickolas.
So you didn't beat Mr. Squeers with a whip, and you didn't take a boy away from the school,
said Ralph Nickleby with a small, cold smile.
Yes, I admit that I did these things, but I did them to stop the suffering of a poor, innocent boy,
replied Nickolas.
When you came from Devon, I looked after all of you,
said Ralph Nickleby, turning to Nickolas's mother.
Now see how your son pays me back for my kindness.
And with these words, he left the house before Nickolas could hit him angrily in the face.
"How can he talk like that?"
cried Kate after he left.
What do you mean?
asked Nickolas.
"While you were in Yorkshire, a friend of his, Sir Mulberry Hawk, treated me very badly. I met him at a dinner that our uncle invited me to, although I didn't want to go. After dinner, I had to go and lie down because I wasn't feeling very well. Sir Mulberry came into the room where I lay and tried to kiss me. I told him to stop, but he didn't. In the end, I had to run out of the room to escape from him."
If I ever see this Mulberry Hawk, I'll teach him a lesson,
said Nickolas angrily.
"Later, I told our uncle everything,"
went on Kate.
"I said that Sir Mulberry needed to say sorry. But Uncle Ralph explained that he couldn't possibly ask him to do that because he was an important business friend."
So this is how our uncle looks after us,
said Nickolas to himself.
He lets his friends do anything that they like with his niece because it's good for business. And he sends me to be a teacher at the worst school in England. What a kind and helpful man our uncle is.
Chapter 4. New Friends and Old Friends. The morning after he arrived in London, Nickolas went to the employment office to look for a job. There were many advertisements in the window of the office for lots of different jobs: servants, clerks, teachers, and more. While Nickolas was looking at these advertisements, he saw a short, fat, older man with kind, smiling eyes looking at them too, and they started talking. The man was very surprised that Nickolas, a young man from a good family and a good student, didn't have a job. Nickolas told him a little about himself, about the death of his father, and about his worries for his mother and sister. The little man listened to him carefully and quietly, sometimes asking him a question or two. But when Nickolas told him about his Uncle Ralph and the way that he treated Kate, the man stood up very quickly and told him,
"Come with me."
Without another word, they took a coach to the business part of the city and went into a large building. Over the door, there was a sign that said, "Cheeryble Brothers."
What's the meaning of this journey? And what does this little man want with me? It's a mystery,
thought Nickolas.
but perhaps something good will come out of it.
Inside the building, the man asked Nickolas to wait a little. He went into an office, and Nickolas could hear two men talking seriously about something for a moment or two. The strange thing was that their voices were exactly the same. After a short time, the door opened, and the man from the employment office asked Nickolas to go in.
Young man, this is my twin brother, Ned Cheeryble, and I'm Charles Cheeryble,
he said. Nickolas's mouth fell open. Charles Cheeryble wasn't exactly as short or as fat as his brother Ned, but in every other way they were the same. They had the same smiling eyes, the same clothes, even the same white hats. Charles's hat was now in his hand, and Ned's was up on the coat rack on the wall. It was clear that they were twins.
Young man, when we first came to this great city, we had no money in our coat pockets and no shoes on our feet,
said Ned.
Since then, we've started this business, and now we've become very rich,
said Charles.
These days, we enjoy helping other people with our money,
Ned went on.
And we'd like to help you. We need a clever young man to help with the accounts for our business,
said Charles.
Our old accounts clerk isn't getting any younger, you see. And we think that you're just the right person for the job,
finished Ned. Nickolas's mouth fell open again.
I can't thank you enough for your kindness. I don't know what to say,
he began.
Then don't say anything,
said Charles.
Now, come on, it's all agreed,
said Ned.
You'll start tomorrow at 8 o'clock in the morning, and I'll show you then what you need to do.
The Cheeryble brothers went on talking together after Nickolas left.
Charles, is anyone living in that little house that we have in Bow? No, Ned, it's empty. Then perhaps Nickolas could live in it with his family, and they could pay a smaller rent than usual, couldn't they, Charles? Or no rent, Ned. We're so rich, and they need the money more than us, after all. You're so right, Charles. Let's tell Nickolas the good news tomorrow morning.
Nickolas started work for the Cheerybles the next day. The twins helped Nickolas a lot, and he quickly learned how to do the accounts. The brothers liked having a laugh with each other and with those around them, and Nickolas enjoyed his work. The next 2 weeks were a very happy time. 2 days after Nickolas started work, Nickolas, Kate, Mrs. Nickleby, and Smike moved into the little house in Bow. The Cheerybles were again very helpful. They sent men to help with the moving, and they also gave the Nicklebys some pieces of furniture for their new home. Every day, when Nickolas came back from work, he found some new change in the house. Kate worked quietly all day to make their little home comfortable. Mrs. Nickleby talked a lot about all the work to do in the house, but did very little of it herself. Smike worked in the garden and made it look very beautiful. The poor boy was happy for the first time in his life. At last, he had a family. He began to eat more and to look less thin. And you could see the change in his face, too. He wasn't afraid or lonely anymore. But after 2 happy weeks, something happened that changed everything. Smike was walking home from the park one afternoon when suddenly someone grabbed his shoulder. He turned round. Before he knew exactly what was happening, that same someone pushed him into a coach. It was Squeers.
What a piece of luck to find you here,
Squeers said, smiling cruelly.
I must go home,
cried Smike, afraid.
Oh, yes, I'll take you home. To Dotheboys Hall in Yorkshire. Mrs. Squeers will be very surprised to see you. Now, I've never beaten a boy in a coach before, but I must say that I'm looking forward to it.
Then Squeers hit Smike again and again with all his strength. The poor boy fell to the floor with his head in his hands. And just then, the coach began to move away fast. Chapter 5. Another Long Walk. The coach, with Squeers and Smike in it, arrived after a while at the inn where Squeers was staying. He pushed Smike inside and got the key of the room next to his, which was empty. Then he pulled Smike upstairs, pushed the poor boy into the empty room and locked the door behind him. His plan was to leave Smike there until next morning, and then take him back to Yorkshire. A short time later, another coach arrived at the inn. In it were Fanny Squeers, her friend Tilda, and John Brodie, now Tilda's husband. All 3 were in London to see the great city for the first time, and they were staying at the same inn as Squeers, who met them downstairs.
You'll never believe who's here. He's an old friend,
he said, smiling strangely.
Nickolas Nickleby?
Asked Fanny.
No, but nearly.
Smike, then?
Yes, it's young Smike, the boy who forgot to say goodbye when he left.
Where is he?
Asked John Brodie with some interest.
I've got him locked away in the empty room next to my room upstairs,
smiled Squeers. Just then, dinner arrived. While they were eating, they talked about Smike and Nickolas. Squeers drank a lot of wine. Slowly, the conversation moved to other things. Tilda and Fanny began talking about the shops in London that they wanted to see. Suddenly, John Brodie started coughing. His face went red and he couldn't stop.
What is it, John?
Said Tilda.
Shall I call a doctor?
No, I'm fine.
He answered, but he went on coughing, and his face got redder and redder.
Do you need to lie down for a few minutes?
She asked.
Yes, go and lie down. Don't call a doctor. They're very expensive in London,
said Squeers. And so Tilda helped John Brodie to walk upstairs. After a few minutes, she came down again, saying that he was asleep in bed.
Good,
said Squeers.
Sleep's cheaper than a doctor.
And he poured himself some more wine. Now alone upstairs, John Brodie went to the room where Smike was. The key was in the lock on the outside of the door. He turned the key quietly and opened the door. Quickly, he put his hand over Smike's mouth to stop him from speaking.
Don't be afraid,
he told Smike.
I'm going to help you to run away.
Taking a screwdriver out of his pocket, he took the lock out of the door and then put both the lock and the screwdriver on the floor. Then, turning to Smike, he said,
You did that before you ran away. Is that clear?
Smike didn't understand.
Look, I don't want Squeers to know that I helped you to run away. My wife is a friend of his daughter's. Now do you see?
Yes, now I do,
replied Smike.
Good. So come with me.
Walking as quietly as they could, they went downstairs. Squeers, Tilda, and Fanny were still eating their dinner. They were all laughing at a story that Tilda was telling. John Brodie opened the front door quietly. Smike, looking at him thankfully, ran out into the night. John Brodie, laughing to himself, went upstairs and lay down on his bed again. Now free from Squeers, Smike ran as fast as he could. He was so afraid that for the first hour he ran towards the west, the wrong way. He understood his mistake when he saw that he was going out of London. So then he turned and walked towards the east. He needed to ask the way often, but he never stopped walking. The first light of the morning sun was in the sky when he arrived at Bow. He was home at last. As soon as Nickolas heard Smike's knock, he opened the front door, and when he saw that Smike was outside, cold, dirty, and exhausted, he embraced him. Kate and Mrs. Nickleby also came down to find out who was calling so early, and it was a very fine thing to see the joy on everybody's faces, now that Smike was back with them once again. All three of them were worried when they heard that Squeers was back in town, and that he wanted to take Smike back to Yorkshire with him. But they were all very happy to hear of the poor boy's escape from the inn with John Brodie's help. Not long after Smike's adventure with Squeers, a strange thing happened at the Cheeryble brothers' offices. Nickolas needed to show a letter to Charles. Knocking at his office door, he heard no reply.
I'll leave it on his desk for him to look at when he comes back,
thought Nickolas, opening the door. He was surprised to see that Charles was in his office. He was talking to a young woman who was sitting in front of him. She was 18 or 19 and very beautiful. She was also crying a lot, and then suddenly she fainted. Charles asked Nickolas to leave the office immediately and to send in his brother, Ned. Nickolas was so surprised by the sight of this beautiful girl that he could only stand looking at her without moving or speaking. Just then, Ned hurried into the office.
My dear Nickolas,
he said,
you must leave the room at once. Don't worry about this young lady. She'll be well again soon. Leave us, I beg you.
But who is she?
Nickolas asked himself while he was leaving the room. Chapter 6. Nickolas in Love. For an hour after leaving Charles's office, Nickolas could do no work. He sat at his desk, thinking about the beautiful young woman still inside with Charles and Ned. The time passed very slowly. Then, at last, Ned Cheeryble came out of Charles's office.
Is she better?
Asked Nickolas.
Who?
Replied Ned.
The young lady.
Oh, yes, she's fine now.
Nickolas tried to find out more about her from him, but Ned was strangely silent all that afternoon. During the next few days, the young lady came and went many times. Her talks with the Cheeryble brothers were always secret, and they always happened inside Ned's or Charles's office, behind closed doors. Nickolas often tried to find out more about her, but the Cheeryble brothers never talked about her with him. Day after day, Nickolas thought of her more and more. He wanted to tell his sister about her, but what could he say? He didn't even know the young woman's name. But in the middle of all this, Nickolas didn't forget his friends. The Brodys were leaving London soon to go back to Yorkshire. So he invited them to dinner. They came to the house the next night, and at first it was a happy evening. They talked for a long time about Squeers and Smike, and how Brodie helped Smike to escape. They all laughed when Brodie described how angry Squeers looked when he found the lock, the screwdriver, the empty bed, and no Smike in the room. Smike laughed more than the rest. Mrs. Nickleby thanked John Brodie more than 20 times for treating her son so kindly in Yorkshire. It was 11 o'clock, and the Brodys were leaving, when they heard a loud knock at the door.
Who could that be so late?
Said Mrs. Nickleby, going to open it. Outside the door stood Ralph Nickleby with Squeers, and a third man. They all came at once into the house.
I've got something important to say to you all,
said Ralph Nickleby.
You have nothing to say to us, and we have nothing to say to you,
said Nickolas angrily, walking towards his uncle. John Brodie stopped him.
Let's hear what he has to say,
he said.
Yes, listen. You'll find it very interesting,
said Squeers.
It's very simple,
said Ralph Nickleby.
My nephew Nickolas took Smike away from school in Yorkshire.
Ralph Nickleby now pointed at the third man.
This gentleman here is Mr. Snorley. He's young Smike's father, and he wants Smike to go back to that school.
Mr. Snorley then walked over to Smike.
My dearest son, come to your father,
he said while he embraced him. Nickolas and John Brodie looked at each other in surprise.
If anyone doesn't believe what I've just said, here are some papers which show that it's all true,
said Ralph Nickleby, pulling some papers out of his coat pocket. Nickolas looked at them quickly.
If these papers are real,
he said,
Mr. Snorley and Smike's mother separated when Smike was only a year old. He's not seen his son since then, until today.
Suddenly, Smike spoke.
I don't want to go with that man. I don't know him. I want to stay here with you, Nickolas.
But I want my son,
said Snorley.
Your son, if he really is that,
said Nickolas,
chooses for himself. And he chooses to stay. So he'll stay.
Listen to how he speaks,
said Squeers, moving forward to grab Smike. Seeing this, John Brodie stood in front of Smike. He pushed Squeers back hard with one of his big hands, and Squeers fell back at once onto Ralph Nickleby, who was just behind him. Then Ralph Nickleby fell over too. When they got up from the floor, Nickolas said,
Now leave this house at once, and don't come back.
You'll be sorry for what you've done tonight. You can't come between a man and his son,
Ralph Nickleby said, raising his voice. Then the three men left, shouting many other angry threats behind them, while they were going out of the front door. That night, Nickolas slept very little. Could Snorley and Squeers really decide on poor Smike's future? The next day, he told Charles Cheeryble about Snorley and about his uncle's threats.
Don't be afraid of these men,
said Charles.
Early this morning, your uncle came to see me too. He tried to make me think badly of you, but I didn't listen to him. I'll do everything I can to help you, your family, and Smike. So don't worry. Smike will stay with you.
Your words have given me strength. How can I ever thank you enough for all that you've done?
Asked Nickolas.
By not talking about it, my dear friend,
replied Charles.
Now, I'm going to give you a special and secret job.
Charles was nervous, and he began to walk up and down the room while he spoke.
Please tell me what it is,
said Nickolas.
I'll try my very best to do it well.
Do you remember that very sad young lady who was in my office a few days ago?
Yes, of course I do,
replied Nickolas.
Her name's Madeline. Many, many years ago, I loved her mother. But, sadly, in the end, she married another man, whose name is Bray. Their life together was not happy, because he had many debts. Near the end of her life, she came to me asking for my help with some of these debts, and I was truly happy to help her. Bray's been very ill for many years now, and can't do very much to help himself.
And how does he treat his daughter?
Asked Nickolas.
Very badly. He thinks only of himself, never of her. Now, when the mother died, she asked her only daughter, Madeline, to look after her father. Madeline has never forgotten this, but there are still many of her father's debts to pay, and Madeline finds it very hard. This is where my brother Ned and I are trying to help. Madeline is an artist, and we buy her pictures, usually for much more than the real price. This is the only money that she has. But we don't want Bray to know who is buying the pictures, because he hates me and has always hated me. Your job is to go to Bray's house with the money and to come back with the pictures. You mustn't tell Bray that you've come from the Cheerybles, of course.
I understand,
said Nickolas. he went back to his work with 2 words sounding in his head.
Madeline Bray.
Those 2 words were like music to Nickolas's ears. The next day, Nickolas went to the Brays' house and bought one of Madeline's pictures. While he was there, Bray shouted at him.
"Don't think that we need your help,"
he cried.
"We come from a better family than you, my daughter and I."
At the door, Madeline said,
"Please don't think badly of my father. He's ill and suffers so much. And please don't say anything of this to the Cheerable brothers. They're so kind to us."
Ask me to do anything that you like. I'm your servant,
answered Nickolas. At once, Madeline turned her head, began to cry, and hurried back into the house. One afternoon, not long after Nickolas started visiting the Brays' house, Newman Noggs came to see him at home.
"It's very good to see you, my friend,"
said Nickolas, showing Noggs into the front room.
"And you, Nickolas, but I bring bad news, I'm afraid. I believe that you know Madeline Bray."
"Yes, I do. Why? Has something happened to her?"
asked Nickolas worriedly.
"Not yet, but she's in great danger. This morning I overheard a conversation between your uncle and Mr. Arthur Gride."
"Who's he?"
asked Nickolas.
"He's a moneylender, like your uncle. He's an ugly old man with no friends and no kindness in his heart. Madeline's father borrowed a lot of money from him in the past, and one day he must pay it all back. Gride has never been married, and now that he's an old man, he wants only one thing."
Suddenly, Nickolas's heart went cold.
"Gride has agreed to cancel Bray's debt if Bray gives him Madeline's hand in marriage."
Noggs went on.
"No, that can't be true,"
cried Nickolas. Chapter 7. Night comes on.
"I'm afraid that it is true, Nickolas,"
went on Noggs.
"Your uncle has agreed to talk to Bray about Madeline for Gride. If Bray agrees to the marriage with his daughter, Gride will pay your uncle a small part of the cancelled debt. This means that
Gride is planning to buy a young wife, and that my uncle is helping him for money,"
said Nickolas.
"But will Bray agree?"
I know Bray. He's a man with no heart. He won't think of his daughter's happiness. He's old, and he just wants to get rid of his debts before he dies."
"I won't let this happen. I must stop it,"
said Nickolas. The next morning, Ralph Nickleby was at Gride's house.
"Yesterday evening I spoke to Bray."
"And?"
"He's agreed to the marriage in 2 days' time."
"And what about Madeline?"
asked Gride.
"Don't worry about her. She'll agree to it if her father says yes,"
answered Ralph Nickleby.
"Come to my place at 7 the day after tomorrow, and don't visit her between now and then. You've seen too much of her lately. That's dangerous. She doesn't love you, and we don't want anything to change our plans."
That afternoon, Nickolas again went to the Brays' house. He took a small picture from Madeline and gave her £5 for it. Her hand was shaking when she took the money from him. At the door, he spoke to her quietly.
Madeline, I know about the marriage with Gride, and I beg you not to do it.
How do you know about it?
She asked, her face white.
It doesn't matter, but please don't marry Gride just because your father tells you to. Your happiness is important too.
But I must do what my father tells me. There are more important things than my happiness. I beg you not to speak of this anymore.
Just then, they heard Bray's voice from his room upstairs.
If you've given Madeline the money, young man, why are you still here? And you needn't come back again. Madeline won't need to sell any more pictures soon. Goodbye.
Madeline ran back into the house, closing the door.
This won't be easy,
thought Nickolas. 2 days later, Ralph Nickleby and Gride went to the Brays' house for the wedding. A servant opened the door to them, and they waited downstairs. After a short time, Bray came into the room. He asked to speak to Ralph Nickleby alone.
Madeline was very ill last night. Do you think that I'm cruel to marry my daughter to Gride? He's so old after all.
No, I think it's a fine plan,
answered Ralph Nickleby quickly.
I thought that it was when we spoke before, but now I'm not so sure.
Don't worry. Gride won't live for many more years. And when he dies, she'll be rich, and then she can marry any man that she chooses.
Yes, that's a good way to think of it. Well, I must go and see her.
And he went upstairs again. Suddenly, there was a knock at the front door. And a moment later, Nickolas and Kate hurried into the room.
What are you doing here?
asked Ralph Nickleby.
We've come to stop your plan,
said Nickolas. Nickolas and his uncle looked long and hard at each other like two old enemies.
Why did you come here with your sister?
Ralph Nickleby asked Nickolas.
It'll make me very happy to push you out into the street, but I don't want to hurt your sister. So, Kate, please leave at once.
It's strange that today you're worried about hurting me,
replied Kate.
You weren't worried about me when I told you about Sir Mulberry Hawk. You said that business came first. And now you and Gride are using poor Madeline to pay a debt. Admit it. It's just business to you, isn't it?
You're making a great mistake, my dear young niece. Madeline is going to be married to Mr. Gride today. That's all. And if you don't leave now, you and your brother will get hurt,
said Ralph Nickleby coldly.
I won't leave this house until we take Madeline out of it,
replied Kate. Suddenly, they heard a thump and a scream of,
He's dead!
from upstairs. They all looked at each other and then ran up to Bray's bedroom at once. Bray was lying still on the floor, and his daughter lay next to him, her arms round his dead body.
She's fainted,
said Nickolas to himself, and he quickly picked her up and started to carry her downstairs.
Stop that at once,
said his uncle angrily.
What are you doing?
I'm taking Madeline to my house, and don't you try to stop me.
You can't do that. This man,
Ralph Nickleby said, pointing at Gride,
is going to be her husband.
That's right. Listen to him,
said Gride.
No, listen to me,
said Nickolas to his uncle.
The debts that Bray had are cancelled by his death. so there's no need now for Madeline to marry Gride. And between you and me, I think that you should start worrying about your debts. Just yesterday, I overheard some people talking at the office where I work about one of your investments. I believe you'll soon find out that you've just lost £10,000, sir.
That's not true,
screamed Ralph Nickleby, putting his hand to his heart.
Oh, yes it is. Your day's past, and night is coming on. Now, will you let me and my sister leave with Madeline?
Leaving the house, Nickolas quickly found a coach, and soon he, Kate, and Madeline were on their way to the house in Bow. During the next few days, Madeline was very ill and stayed in bed. Kate looked after her and brought her food to bring back her strength. The two young women became the nearest and dearest of friends during that time. But while Madeline was getting better, another person in the house was getting ill. Smike. He was very thin, and he had a cough that was becoming worse and worse. He was also very weak, and now couldn't walk from room to room. The doctor came to see him.
He's had consumption for a long time,
he said.
It's because of all those years of being cold, hungry and dirty in Yorkshire. He has it very badly now, and it's possible that he'll die of it. I'm afraid there's only one thing that can help him. He must leave the city and go into the country. The air there will be good for him, but it's perhaps already too late.
So Nickolas, after talking with the Cheerybles, took Smike down to Devon. They rented some rooms in a house very near his father's old home. Nickolas showed Smike all the places that he loved as a child. One afternoon, they visited his father's grave under a big tree near the old Nickleby house. But Smike grew weaker and weaker every day. Soon, he couldn't leave his bed. So Nickolas sat next to him and talked to him or read to him for hours and hours. When Smike's suffering was at its worst, Nickolas was always there to make him more comfortable. Then, one warm autumn evening, Smike became very much worse. It was clear to both of them that he was dying.
I'm not afraid to die,
Smike said,
because I know that we'll meet again.
Yes, I'm sure that we will,
Nickolas said.
I'd like to lie in a grave near your father's grave, in that beautiful place under the tree near your old house.
I'll make sure that you do.
Now I can die happily,
Smike said. And soon after that, Smike took his last breath. At about the same time, a letter arrived for Ralph Nickleby. While he read it, his face turned white. £10,000 lost in a bad investment. It was too cruel. And soon all of London would know this terrible news. His nephew Nickolas knew it already. Ralph Nickleby's hand shook when he put the letter down on the table. Once a rich moneylender, he was now suddenly poor. How could he possibly survive? There was no hope for him. Chapter 8. The Church Bells Ring. Early on the day after Ralph Nickleby learnt of his bad investment, Charles Cheeryble went to see him.
I have some very important news for you,
Charles said as soon as he arrived.
If it's about my bad investment, I already know it,
answered Ralph Nickleby quickly.
No, it's something different.
I'm not interested.
Look, I wanted to tell you this news in a kind way, so that you can put right what you've done wrong while there's still time. Next time, it'll be harder,
said Charles when he left. Later that day, Ralph Nickleby went out for a walk. While he was walking, he thought darkly about the last few days. Nothing was going right, and at every wrong turn along the way, there was Nickolas. After an hour, he saw that he was near Snorley's house. Snorley often did little jobs for him, like when he agreed to be Smike's father for the day. But when Ralph Nickleby knocked on Snorley's front door, there was no answer. He knocked again and saw someone looking down from an upstairs window and then quickly moving away. In the end, Mrs. Snorley came to the door.
He's not here,
she said.
He's gone out.
But I can see him standing at the window upstairs,
replied Nickleby, laughing uneasily.
It's not him. Please leave us alone,
she said, closing the door in his face. Ralph Nickleby still wanted to talk to someone. He decided to walk to Gride's house. He arrived there after another hour's walk and knocked a number of times on the door, but there was no answer. Gride also was not at home to answer him. That evening, there was a loud knock at Ralph Nickleby's front door. It was Ned Cheeryble.
Please come with me immediately,
he said.
Now we have more news to tell you, and it's not good, I'm afraid.
I can see that you people won't leave me alone until you've told me everything,
Ralph Nickleby replied, putting on his coat and hat and following Ned Cheeryble to his house. At the Cheerybles' place, Ralph Nickleby sat down by the fire. He saw that another man was sitting quietly in a big chair far from the fire, but the room was too dark to see his face clearly.
Mr. Nickleby, I'm sorry to tell you that a young man has just died. A young man who needed your love and help more than any other,
began Charles.
Ha! Do you mean that Nickolas is dead?
Said Nickleby.
But this is good news, not bad news.
At this, the person in the chair stood up. And now Ralph Nickleby could see his face in the light from the fire.
You know this gentleman, I believe,
said Charles Cheeryble.
It's Mr. Brooker, who worked for you a long time ago.
Yes, of course I know him. What are you doing here?
He said, turning to Brooker.
Mr. Nickleby, the young man that Mr. Cheeryble talked of, who is now dead...
Yes? What about him?
He was your only son.
That's not true!
Cried Ralph Nickleby.
But it is,
said Brooker, and he went on.
As a young man, you were secretly married and had a son. Your marriage was unhappy because you married your wife for her money, and her parents didn't let her have it when they learnt of her secret wedding. After you separated, your wife took her baby son with her and went to live with her family. But she became ill and died when the child was 4 years old. You sent me to get your son, and I brought him to your house. You were away from London for 6 weeks on business. So I stayed alone with the little boy in the house. Like his mother, the child wasn't very strong, and I called a doctor. The doctor said that the boy needed good country air to survive. So I sent the boy to Dotheboys Hall in Yorkshire, and I paid Squeers myself. I told him that the boy's name was Smike. When you came back home, I told you that the boy became ill and was dead.
Brooker then turned to the Cheeryble brothers and said,
I admit now that what I did was bad. I planned to tell Mr. Nickleby the true story some time later, and to get money from him before I told him where the boy was. You see, he was very cruel to me in the past, and I wanted to have my revenge on him.
That doesn't matter now. Just tell him what happened later,
said Ned Cheeryble.
Yes, of course,
said Brooker.
I paid for Smike to stay at Dotheboys Hall for the next 5 years. Then I was sent to prison for the next 8 years. And for the last 3 of those years, I couldn't pay for the school. Squeers kept the boy there, but not out of kindness. Smike became the servant of the Squeers family, working for nothing. When I got out of prison last year, I went to Yorkshire to see Smike. I found out that he was now with your nephew, Nickolas. I followed them to their house in Bow. There I met Nickolas, who told me about the sad end of poor Smike, who died of consumption in Devon only yesterday.
Ralph Nickleby was looking down at his hands all this time. He said nothing. The room was now dark. No one spoke. And then suddenly Nickleby got up and walked quickly out of the room and out of the house. Outside it was a windy night. He went back home. Inside the large, dark, cold house, he tried to imagine the son that he once had, as a little boy, playing on the floor. He tried to imagine the wife that he once had, making dinner for the 3 of them. But his eyes came back to his house, empty of love, as it really was. Just then, the church bells outside rang midnight. Nickleby went to the window, and looking up at the bells, he shouted,
Ring, bells! Ring for the coming in of every year that brings this terrible world nearer to its end.
The next morning they found him, with a rope round his neck, hanging dead in his kitchen. Some weeks after Ralph Nickleby's death, Nickolas and Madeline got married and were very happy. Kate married Frank Cheeryble, the Cheeryble brothers' nephew. He was a friendly young man with the same kind, smiling eyes as his uncles, and he and Nickolas became good friends. After some years, when Charles and Ned Cheeryble stopped working, a new sign went up over the door of their London offices. It said, Cheeryble and Nickleby. Arthur Gride did not try to marry any more young women, but he came to a bad end. Thieves broke into his house one night, stole all his money, and murdered him in his bed while he was sleeping. Squeers went to prison in the end for his criminal ways, and that was the end of Dotheboys Hall. Before the boys left the school for the last time, they broke as much of the place and the furniture in it as they could. John Brodie helped the smaller boys move to some of the homes in his village and in other villages that were near. And the Nicklebys and the Brodies often visited each other. When Nickolas had enough money, he bought his father's old house in Devon, and Kate and Frank bought a house for themselves not far from it. Mrs. Nickleby lived some of the time with Kate and the rest of the time with Nickolas. And after some years, there were two groups of children playing in the same places where once Nickolas and Kate played as children. Newman Noggs went to live in a small house next to Nickolas's house in Devon. When Nickolas and his family were in London, he looked after their country home. When they were in Devon, Newman's greatest joy was to play with the little children. In spring and summer, those children put flowers on a small grave near the house. It lay under a tree, just next to the grave of Nickolas's and Kate's father, and it belonged to the boy that they knew as their cousin Smike.